Every day, people change your mind. They shape your decisions, direct your attention, influence your emotions, and alter your behavior, often without you realizing it. A conversation changes your opinion. An advertisement creates a desire. A leader inspires loyalty. A stranger earns your trust. Somewhere beneath each of these moments, invisible forces are at work. Most people move through life unaware of these forces. They see outcomes, but not the mechanisms behind them. They see persuasion, but not the psychology. They see success, but not the hidden architecture that produced it. Yet there are individuals who seem to understand something others do not. They enter a room and command attention. They build trust quickly. They persuade without pressure. They lead without force. Opportunities gravitate toward them. Alliances form around them, and their influence extends far beyond their words. This is not luck. It is not magic, and it is rarely natural talent. It is understanding. Understanding how attention works, how trust is created, how decisions are made, how emotions shape judgment, how human beings are influenced long before they become aware of being influenced. This book explores that hidden system. Within these pages are 15 timeless laws that govern influence in business, leadership, negotiation, relationships, and everyday life. These principles have shaped empires, built movements, created fortunes, and transformed ordinary individuals into extraordinary leaders. Some of these laws will feel familiar. Others may challenge your assumptions. A few may completely change how you view the people around you. Most importantly, they will help you recognize the forces that are already shaping your life. Because influence is happening whether you understand it or not. The question is simple. Will you remain unaware of the code that governs human behavior? Or will you learn to see it? The pages ahead are an invitation into a world most people never notice. A world where attention becomes power, perception becomes reality, and understanding human nature becomes one of the greatest advantages a person can possess. The first law begins with the foundation of all influence. Attention. Law 1. Control attention. Control reality. Before you can influence what a person thinks, you must first control what they notice. Before you can shape what they feel, you must first direct where their mind is pointing. Before you can move them anywhere, you must first command the resource that makes all movement possible, their attention. Attention is the gateway to everything. It is the single most precious cognitive resource a human being possesses, and it is finite in ways that money and time and energy are not. You can earn more money. You can restructure your schedule to find more time. But your capacity to attend, to truly focus your awareness on one thing at the expense of everything else, is fixed. At any given moment, you can only attend to a limited number of things, and whatever fills that capacity shapes your perception of reality in that moment. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is a neurological fact. The brain does not passively receive the world. It actively constructs a version of the world based on what it is paying attention to. Two people in the same room, experiencing the same events, but with their attention directed at different elements of those events, are in a meaningful sense living in different realities. One notices the tension in the speaker's voice. The other notices the power of their words. One notices the uncertainty in the negotiation. The other notices the opportunity. The room is the same. The reality is not. This means that whoever controls the direction of attention controls the experienced reality of the person whose attention they have captured. And whoever controls experienced reality controls the decisions, the feelings, and ultimately the behavior that flows from that reality. The most sophisticated practitioners of influence understand this at a deep level. They do not begin by making arguments. They begin by directing attention. They understand that the frame, the context in which information is presented, the aspect of a situation that is highlighted versus left in shadow, matters more than the content of the information itself, because the content will be processed through whatever frame has already been established, and the frame is built entirely from what the attention has been pointed at first. Consider how this works in practice. A skilled communicator presenting a proposal does not begin with the features of what they are proposing. They begin by directing attention to the problem the proposal solves. They paint a picture of the cost of inaction, the weight of the unresolved challenge, the discomfort of remaining in the current situation. They make the problem real and present, and felt in the listener's mind before they offer the solution. And then, when they do present the solution, it arrives into a mind that is already primed to receive it, that is already oriented toward wanting exactly what is being offered. This is attention control as the foundation of influence, and it is operating in every effective act of persuasion you have ever witnessed, whether you recognized it or not. There is a specific technique that lives at the heart of attention control, and it is what we might call the technique of contrast framing. The mind does not evaluate things in absolute terms. It evaluates them in relative terms, in comparison to whatever has been presented just before. A salary offer that follows a discussion of a much higher benchmark feels inadequate regardless of its absolute value. The same offer, following a discussion of the lower end of the market, feels generous. The number has not changed. The attention frame that preceded it has. And that frame determines the emotional and cognitive response. Skilled negotiators use contrast framing constantly. They present an initial position that is deliberately more extreme than what they actually want, so that their genuine position, when introduced, feels like a concession and a reasonable middle ground. Skilled marketers use it when they display a premium option alongside a standard option, making the standard option appear more accessible and reasonably priced by comparison. Skilled storytellers use it when they establish the darkness of a situation before introducing the light, so that the light feels genuinely luminous rather than merely adequate. In each case, the content has not changed. What has changed is the attentional context in which the content is received, and that context determines everything. There is a second dimension of attention control that is equally important: the control of your own attention in relation to others. The person who is visibly distracted, who is checking their surroundings, monitoring other conversations, or clearly thinking about something other than the person in front of them, communicates a message that is devastating to influence. They communicate that the person in front of them is not worth their full attention. And a person who does not feel fully attended to, does not trust, does not open, and does not move toward the person who has withheld their attention. By contrast, the person who offers full, genuine, unhurried attention to another human being creates an experience that is, in the modern world, startlingly rare. People are so accustomed to partial attention, to the half-listening that passes for conversation, that receiving complete, genuine focus from another person produces a kind of gratitude that borders on warmth. And gratitude, as we will see in later laws, is one of the most powerful preconditions for influence that exists. Mastering attention, then, means two things. It means learning to direct the attention of others toward what serves your purpose. And it means learning to give your own attention fully and strategically, as a gift that creates connection, and as a signal that establishes your serious engagement with the person you are with. Together, these two skills form the foundation of everything that follows in this book. Because without attention, nothing else is possible. With it, everything begins. Law 2. The person who sets the frame wins. Every interaction has a frame. Every conversation, every negotiation, every relationship has an underlying set of assumptions about what is happening, what matters, what the rules are, and what the possible outcomes are. This framework is usually invisible. It is almost never explicitly stated, but it governs the interaction more powerfully than any of the words that are spoken within it. The person who sets the frame wins, not always in the sense of getting every specific thing they want, but in the deeper sense that the frame determines the range of possible outcomes, and the person who set it has already eliminated all the outcomes that fall outside it. They have defined the game, and when you define the game, you have a structural advantage over everyone who is playing by the rules you established. This is why the most important moment in any high-stakes interaction is not the moment of the explicit negotiation, the moment of the ask, the moment of the decision. It is the moment before that, the moment in which the frame is established, often without either party acknowledging that this is what is happening. Think about the job interview. The candidate who arrives and immediately begins responding to the employer's questions has accepted the frame in which they are the supplicant, seeking approval, auditioning for a role that the employer controls. This frame is not necessarily inaccurate, but it establishes a power dynamic that disadvantages the candidate from the start. The candidate who arrives and, early in the conversation, begins asking thoughtful, substantive questions about the role and the organization has subtly reframed the interaction. They are now evaluating as well as being evaluated. The power dynamic has shifted, even though the nominal situation, an interview, has not changed. The frame shift is everything. And it was accomplished not through argument or confrontation, but through a simple behavioral choice that communicated a different understanding of what was happening. The mechanics of frame setting operate through several specific pathways. The first is the pathway of language. The words you use to describe a situation are the bricks with which you build the frame. If you describe a price as an investment, you have placed it in a frame of return and value. If your counterpart describes it as a cost, they are trying to place it in a frame of loss and burden. These are not just semantic differences. They activate different cognitive and emotional responses, and they channel the conversation toward different conclusions. The second pathway is the pathway of precedent. The first thing that happens in any interaction tends to set the tone and the standard for everything that follows. The first question asked defines the territory that the conversation will cover. The first number mentioned in a negotiation becomes the anchor around which all subsequent numbers are evaluated. The first gesture of authority or deference establishes the power dynamic that will persist unless actively disrupted. This is why skilled operators pay such close attention to how interactions begin. The opening move is the frame move. The third pathway is the pathway of narrative. Every situation can be told as multiple different stories. The same set of facts can be framed as a crisis or an opportunity, as evidence of failure or evidence of growth, as a reason to fear or a reason to act. The person who controls the narrative controls the frame, and the person who controls the frame controls how every subsequent piece of information within that narrative will be interpreted. Consider a company that has missed its quarterly targets. The leader who frames this situation as a temporary challenge in a longer positive trajectory, pointing to specific structural improvements and market dynamics that explain the shortfall and giving a credible account of why the next period will look different, has set a frame that keeps confidence, motivation, and investment relatively stable. The same facts, framed as evidence of fundamental dysfunction, would produce entirely different responses from employees, investors, and partners. The numbers are the same. The frame determines the outcome. Defending against unwanted frames is as important as setting useful ones. When someone attempts to frame you in a way that does not serve you, the worst response is to argue within their frame, to accept the terms of the conversation as they have defined them and try to win within those terms, because arguing within a frame reinforces the frame. It legitimizes the terms of the conversation as defined by the other party. The correct response is a reframe, a move that does not argue with the content of what has been said, but gently and firmly declines the terms in which it has been offered, and substitutes a different set of terms. This is one of the most sophisticated skills in the entire domain of influence, and it requires both the awareness to recognize when an unwanted frame is being imposed and the composure to decline it without appearing defensive or rattled. Law 3. Create the need before offering the solution. No one buys a solution to a problem they do not believe they have. No one accepts help they do not believe they need. No one moves toward a destination they have not first felt the pull toward. This is one of the most fundamental principles of influence, and it is violated constantly by people who wonder why their excellent ideas, their generous offers, and their brilliant solutions are being ignored or rejected. The answer is almost always the same. They led with the solution before establishing the need. They brought the answer before the question was fully felt. They offered the medicine before the patient had acknowledged the illness. And a medicine offered to someone who does not believe they are sick is not received as a gift. It is received as an imposition. The law of creating need before offering solutions rests on a simple psychological truth. People do not make decisions primarily on the basis of logic. They make decisions on the basis of emotion, and they use logic afterward to justify what the emotion has already decided. The emotion that is most reliably associated with motivation is discomfort, the experience of a gap between how things are and how they should be, between the current situation and the desired situation. When that gap is felt, when it is vivid and real and present, the mind begins actively searching for ways to close it. And that search is the moment of maximum openness to a solution. The skilled influencer does not wait for this discomfort to arise naturally. They create the conditions in which it will arise. They direct attention, as we discussed in the first law, toward the aspects of the current situation that are unsatisfactory. They help the other person feel the weight of what is not working, what is being lost, what the cost of inaction actually is. They make the problem real and vivid before they make the solution available. This is not manipulation in the sense of creating false problems. It is the art of bringing genuine problems into conscious awareness, of helping people see clearly what they have been avoiding looking at, and of creating the emotional clarity that precedes genuine motivation. There are several techniques for creating the experience of need. The first is what we might call the technique of loss articulation. People are, psychologically speaking, more motivated by the prospect of loss than by the prospect of gain. This is a robust and well-documented finding in behavioral psychology, often referred to as loss aversion. The influencer who frames the need in terms of what will be lost if nothing changes, rather than what will be gained if something does, is working with the grain of human psychology rather than against it. The second technique is what we might call the technique of the vivid contrast. The gap between current reality and desired reality is most powerfully felt when both are made vivid. Not just telling someone that things could be better, but painting a picture of what better actually looks and feels like in specific, sensory, emotionally resonant terms, and then contrasting that with a similarly vivid rendering of the current situation. When both poles of the contrast are fully felt, the gap between them becomes a source of genuine motivational energy. The third technique is what we might call the technique of the cost inventory. Often, people are aware in a vague way that a situation is not serving them, but they have not taken full stock of what it is actually costing them. The cost in time, in energy, in opportunity, in relationships, in well-being, in the compound effect of all these costs over time. Walking someone through a careful and honest accounting of what the status quo is actually costing them is often the most powerful thing you can do to prepare them to receive a solution with genuine openness rather than mere polite interest. The application of this law extends far beyond formal persuasion contexts. In leadership, the most effective change agents understand that before they can move people toward a new direction, they must create genuine discomfort with the current one. In teaching, the most effective educators understand that a student who is genuinely puzzled is more ready to learn than one who believes they already understand. In relationships, the person who wants to create positive change understands that naming the problem, making it specific and real and mutually acknowledged, must precede any meaningful conversation about solutions. Create the need. Make it vivid, felt, and real. And only then, when the other person is genuinely searching for a way forward, offer the path you have prepared. Law 4. The Mirror Principle. People trust most those who are most like them. This is not a preference or a tendency. It is a deeply ingrained psychological response that has roots in human evolutionary history. In environments where survival depended on group membership and the accurate identification of allies versus threats, similarity was one of the most reliable signals of trustworthiness. Those who looked like you, moved like you, spoke like you, and shared your reference points were far more likely to be members of your group, far more likely to have aligned interests, and far more likely to be safe. The modern world is vastly different from the ancestral environments in which this psychology was formed. But the psychology itself has not changed. We are still hardwired to feel more comfortable with, more trusting toward, and more open to influence from people who seem similar to us. And the skilled practitioner of influence understands this and uses it with precision. The mirror principle operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, it operates through what psychologists call behavioral mirroring. The subtle, largely unconscious matching of another person's posture, gesture, pace of speech, vocabulary, and energy level. Research consistently shows that people who are naturally or deliberately mirrored by another person experience that person as more likable, more trustworthy, and more persuasive, without being able to identify why. This is because behavioral mirroring, when done well, operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. We do not notice that someone is matching our posture. We simply feel, somehow, that they are in sync with us, that they understand us, that they are on our wavelength. And this feeling, vague but powerful, creates the foundation of rapport, which is in turn the foundation of influence. The technique of deliberate mirroring begins with genuine attention to the other person, which is itself a requirement. You cannot mirror effectively from a position of distraction or self-absorption. You must be genuinely attending to the person, noticing how they hold themselves, how quickly or slowly they speak, what vocabulary they favor, what their emotional register is in this particular conversation. And then, without mimicking, without doing it in a way that could be noticed or feel like mockery, you gently orient your own behavior toward theirs. Mirroring pace of speech is particularly powerful and particularly underestimated. A person who naturally speaks quickly feels slightly rushed or slightly dismissed in conversation with someone who speaks much more slowly. A person who speaks slowly and thoughtfully feels slightly anxious and unheard with someone who moves at high speed. When you match another person's pace of speech, even approximately, you signal at a fundamental level that you are in the same rhythm, and that signal creates comfort that translates directly into openness. Beyond behavioral mirroring, the mirror principle operates at the level of values and identity. The person who can genuinely reflect back to another person something true and important about who they are, who can articulate what someone values and believes in terms that feel accurate and honoring, creates a far deeper bond than any amount of behavioral synchrony can achieve on its own. This is the art of deep listening applied to the domain of influence. When someone feels that you truly see them, not just their surface presentation, but their actual values, their actual concerns, their actual sense of self, they experience a quality of recognition that is extraordinarily bonding. This form of mirroring requires real skill because it requires real understanding. You cannot fake it by using flattery or by making generic observations that could apply to anyone. The specific detail matters. The thing noticed that others usually miss. The value acknowledged that the person is not used to having acknowledged. The aspect of their character reflected back with precision and warmth. These specific reflections are what create the experience of being truly seen, and that experience is the beginning of genuine trust. The mirror principle also contains an important ethical dimension. Mirroring used in service of genuine connection, of creating the conditions for honest, open communication, of making someone feel safe enough to share what they actually think and feel, is a legitimate and valuable skill. Mirroring used to manufacture a false sense of rapport in order to exploit someone's trust is a violation of the principle's ethical foundation. The distinction, as with all the laws in this book, lies in intent and in what the influence serves. Law 5. The debt of reciprocity. Give something, and you create an obligation. This is the law of reciprocity, one of the oldest and most universally documented principles in the study of human social behavior. Across cultures, across historical periods, across vastly different social and economic contexts, the principle holds. When someone does something for you, you feel a pull, sometimes gentle, sometimes powerful, toward doing something in return. This pull is not merely courtesy. It is a deep psychological and even biological imperative. Human societies are built on exchange, and the maintenance of exchange requires that both parties fulfill their obligations. The violation of this principle, taking without giving, receiving without returning, creates a social discomfort so powerful that most people will go to considerable lengths to relieve it, including doing things they would not otherwise have chosen to do. The skilled practitioner of influence understands this principle and uses it deliberately. Not crudely, not in a way that feels transactional or manipulative, but in ways that are so well integrated into their general way of relating to people that the reciprocity they generate feels like a natural and willing response rather than a calculated outcome. The first dimension of the reciprocity principle is the dimension of the unexpected gift. The exchange that creates the strongest sense of obligation is not the one in which something is given in direct response to a request. It is the one in which something is given proactively, without being solicited, and in a way that feels genuinely generous rather than strategic. When you receive something you did not ask for, something given freely and without apparent expectation of return, the sense of debt you feel is actually stronger than when you receive something you explicitly requested, because the unsolicited gift carries no ambiguity about whether it was deserved. It simply was, and the warmth and the obligation it creates are correspondingly powerful. This is why the most sophisticated users of reciprocity are not the ones who make explicit trades. They are the ones who are consistently, reliably, generously useful to the people in their orbit without keeping visible score. They share information that others need. They make introductions that create value. They offer help before it is asked for. They notice what would be useful to someone and provide it without fanfare or expectation. And over time, this pattern of generosity creates around them a network of people who feel genuinely grateful, who feel a genuine pull toward supporting and helping and reciprocating, and who will respond to requests from this person with a warmth and a willingness that they would not extend to someone with whom they have no history of exchange. The second dimension is the dimension of concession reciprocity. When you make a visible concession in a negotiation, when you give up something or soften your position, you create in the other party a pull toward reciprocating that concession. This is the psychological basis of the classic negotiation technique of starting with an extreme position and moving toward a more reasonable one. The movement itself, regardless of where it started from, feels like a concession and creates the pull of reciprocity. This is why skilled negotiators never simply state their actual position. They create a trajectory of apparent movement toward that position, because the movement is what activates the other party's reciprocity psychology. The goal they actually want feels like something they had to work toward and give things up to get to, and that feeling of mutual effort and mutual concession is what makes the final agreement feel fair and acceptable to both sides. The third dimension of reciprocity is what we might call the dimension of emotional debt. When someone is genuinely kind to you, genuinely supportive, genuinely present in a moment of difficulty, the debt you feel is not just social. It is emotional. You feel bound to that person by something deeper than courtesy. You feel loyalty. And loyalty, once established through genuine emotional exchange, is one of the most durable and powerful forms of influence that exists. The person who creates emotional debt is not the one who performs kindness strategically. They are the one who is genuinely present, genuinely generous, genuinely caring in moments when it costs them something to be so. And the experience of receiving that genuine care creates in others a quality of loyalty that will express itself across years and circumstances in ways that no amount of strategic manipulation could ever achieve. Law 6. The power of scarcity. What is rare is valued. What is abundant is taken for granted. This is a law that operates with such consistency across so many domains of human experience that it barely requires argument. We see it in economics, where supply constraints drive prices upward. We see it in ecology, where species become precious precisely when they become endangered. We see it in relationships, where the person who is always available is appreciated less than the one whose time and attention must be earned. The psychology behind scarcity is rooted in the same cognitive architecture that we discussed in relation to attention. The mind is fundamentally a comparison machine. It does not evaluate things in isolation, but always in relation to their alternatives. And the most powerful comparison of all is the comparison between having something and not having it, between access and the loss of access, between availability and its withdrawal. When something is scarce, or appears to be scarce, The mind shifts from a default posture of mild appreciation to a more activated posture of desire. The awareness that something might not be available for much longer, that others are competing for the same limited resource, that the window of access is closing, triggers a psychological urgency that dramatically amplifies the perceived value of what is being considered. This is why limited time offers are so effective in commercial contexts. Not because they provide new information, but because they activate the loss aversion psychology that makes inaction suddenly feel risky in a way that it did not feel before the scarcity was signaled. In the domain of personal influence, the scarcity principle has several important applications. The first and most important is the application to presence and attention. The person who is always available, who never has demands on their time, who can always be called upon at any moment, communicates inadvertently that their time and attention are plentiful resources. And plentiful resources, by the logic of scarcity, are not particularly valuable. The person who is selectively available, who has genuine priorities and genuine demands on their time, and who makes those felt without making them into a performance of importance, communicates something very different. They communicate that time with them is a finite resource, that their attention, when given, represents a genuine allocation of something scarce, and this perception changes how their presence is valued by the people who have access to it. The second application is to information. Knowledge or insight that appears to be widely available creates less excitement than knowledge that appears to be restricted in its availability. The person who prefaces sharing something with the observation that few people know this, or that this is not widely understood, is activating the scarcity psychology in relation to information. And the information, identical in content, will be received with more attention and accorded more significance than if it had been presented without that framing. The third application is to opportunity. When an offer or opportunity is presented as time-limited or genuinely scarce in its availability, the decision-making psychology of the person receiving it changes. The slow, comfortable deliberation that characterizes decisions about widely available options is replaced by a more urgent calculus that leans toward action. This is why genuinely successful people communicate, not dishonestly, but clearly, when opportunities have real limits on them. Not to manufacture pressure, but to help the other person accurately perceive the stakes of their decision. The ethical constraint on the scarcity principle is straightforward. Manufactured scarcity, false scarcity, the pretense of limitation where none actually exists, is a form of deception. It may produce short-term compliance, but it destroys trust the moment it is discovered. And it is almost always discovered, because people compare notes, and what is presented as uniquely scarce has a way of turning out to be widely available. Real scarcity, communicated honestly, is both a legitimate form of influence and an act of genuine service. It helps people make accurate assessments of the value of what they are considering, and it gives them the information they need to make real decisions rather than false ones. The difference between these two versions of the scarcity principle is the difference between influence and manipulation, and that difference matters. Law 7. Authority and the architecture of trust. People follow those they believe know more than they do. They defer to perceived expertise, accept the guidance of apparent authority, and calibrate their own behavior according to the judgments of those they believe to be more competent, more experienced, or more credentialed than themselves. This is not weakness or stupidity. It is rational delegation. In a complex world where no individual can be an expert in everything, the capacity to identify legitimate authority and defer to it is an essential survival strategy. But the psychology of authority operates on signals, not on substance. People cannot in most cases directly assess the depth of expertise of the person they are dealing with. They cannot run an independent audit of a doctor's medical knowledge, a lawyer's legal reasoning, or an advisor's financial acumen. They rely instead on proxies, on signals that correlate imperfectly but reliably enough with genuine competence. And the person who understands these signals can use them to project an authority that shapes how they are received and responded to. The first signal of authority is what we might call the signal of credentials and markers. Titles, degrees, institutional affiliations, publications, notable associations. These are the formal architecture of credibility. They signal that a recognized institutional process has evaluated and endorsed the person's expertise. When they are present, they do genuine work in establishing the perception of authority, particularly in initial encounters before personal experience of the person's competence is available. The second signal is the signal of confident, specific language. Authority speaks differently than uncertainty. Authority does not hedge excessively, does not use the language of vague possibility when specific probability is available, does not load its statements with qualifications that undermine their force. Authority says, "This is what is happening, this is why it is happening, and this is what to do about it." The confident specificity of this language is itself a signal that the speaker knows whereof they speak. This is not a recommendation to fake confidence you do not have. Fake confidence is brittle and is quickly recognized as such. But genuine competence often goes undercommunicated because the competent person, aware of the genuine complexity of their domain, tends to qualify their statements in ways that inadvertently undermine the impression of authority. Learning to communicate your genuine competence with appropriate confidence, without false certainty, but also without unnecessary hedging, is a crucial skill in the architecture of trust. The third signal is the signal of demonstrated track record. Nothing builds authority more durably than the visible history of having been right before. The advisor who called the last disruption accurately. The strategist whose previous recommendations produced the promised results. The leader whose past decisions have been validated by outcomes. Each of these creates a reservoir of credibility that funds future deference. This is why the most sophisticated builders of authority invest heavily in creating visible records of their accurate judgments, their successful predictions, and their competent interventions. Not in a boastful way, but in a documentable way, in ways that allow others to form an accurate picture of the track record over time. The fourth signal, perhaps the most powerful of all in interpersonal contexts, is the signal of calm certainty under pressure. When things are uncertain and the people around you are anxious, the person who remains genuinely calm, who can hold the full complexity of the situation without visible distress, who speaks with measured thoughtfulness rather than reactive urgency, radiates an authority that exceeds any credential. Because what everyone in a moment of crisis is looking for is someone who has been here before, who knows the territory, who is not frightened by what is frightening everyone else. And the person who can provide that quality of presence becomes the de facto authority in that moment, regardless of any formal title or credential. Law 8. The illusion of choice. Freedom is one of the deepest human needs. People resist being told what to do with a consistency and a force that is remarkable across cultures, personalities, and circumstances. The psychological term for this is reactance. The motivational state that arises when a person perceives that their freedom to choose is being threatened or eliminated, and that pushes them to reassert that freedom, often by doing exactly the opposite of what they were told. Reactance is the enemy of influence. It is the wall that goes up the moment someone feels pushed. And the cardinal error of unsophisticated influencers is that they push, directly and obviously, toward the outcome they want, thereby triggering exactly the psychological force that will push back against them. The solution is the illusion of choice, not the elimination of the other person's freedom, which is both impossible in most contexts and ethically indefensible, but the architecture of a situation in which all the genuinely available paths lead toward the general outcome you are seeking, while the person choosing between them experiences themselves as exercising real autonomy. This is not as sinister as it might initially sound. The illusion of choice is at work in virtually every well-designed decision environment, from the menus at a restaurant, to the layout of a supermarket, to the agenda of a meeting. The designer of the environment has made choices about what options are available, in what order they are presented, and how they are framed. The person navigating the environment experiences genuine choice within that structure. Both things are true simultaneously. In interpersonal influence, the illusion of choice is practiced through the technique of the structured alternative. Rather than asking whether someone wants to do something, the skilled practitioner asks which way they want to do it. Rather than asking whether they are available to meet, they ask whether morning or afternoon works better. Rather than asking whether they want to move forward with something, they ask what aspect they want to start with. Each of these questions contains an embedded assumption that the primary decision has already been made, and it moves the conversation to the level of implementation details, where genuine choice is both real and relatively unconstrained. The other powerful technique within this law is the technique of the self-authored commitment. People are far more likely to follow through on a course of action that they feel they have chosen than on one that they feel has been chosen for them. This means that the skilled influencer often does not tell people what to do. They ask questions that lead the other person to articulate, in their own words, the conclusion that the influencer has already identified as the desired outcome. When a person says the thing themselves, even if they were led gently to that saying, they experience it as their own thought, their own decision, their own commitment. And that sense of ownership creates a quality of follow-through that externally imposed decisions almost never achieve. Because the deepest influence is the influence that feels like freedom. Law 9, the timing principle. The same action, the same words, the same offer, delivered at different moments in time, produces radically different results. This is the timing principle. And it is one of the most consistently underestimated dimensions of influence. People pour enormous energy into crafting the perfect message, the ideal argument, the most compelling offer, and then deliver it at the wrong moment and wonder why it did not land. Timing operates on several levels simultaneously. At the most immediate level, it operates within individual conversations. There is a moment in every conversation when the other person is most open, most receptive, most cognitively and emotionally available to receive what you want to say. That moment is not at the beginning, before rapport has been established. It is not when they are distracted by other concerns. It is not when they are defending a position they have just stated. It is the moment after connection has been made, after their defenses have lowered, after they have said something that signals openness. Learning to recognize and wait for that moment, rather than delivering your key communication the moment you feel ready to deliver it, is one of the most practically valuable skills in this entire domain. At a broader level, timing operates across the arc of relationships. Requests made early in a relationship, before trust has been established, carry a different weight than the same requests made after a long history of mutual exchange. Feedback offered before the recipient is in a state to receive it is heard as criticism. The same feedback, offered after the person has asked for it or has signaled readiness, is heard as help. At the broadest level, timing operates in relation to external circumstances and context. There are moments in collective life, in organizations, in markets, in social movements, when the ground is prepared for certain kinds of ideas and when the same ideas, offered earlier or later, would find no purchase. The person who understands how to read the readiness of an environment and who has the patience to wait for the right moment rather than forcing their ideas onto a context that is not yet ready to receive them, has a form of strategic intelligence that translates directly into effectiveness. The counterintuitive dimension of the timing principle is that it often requires doing nothing when every instinct says to act, to hold a position when the pressure to move is intense, to wait for the question before offering the answer, to allow a silence to extend past the point of comfort. These are forms of discipline that most people do not develop because they are uncomfortable. But the discomfort is the price of the timing advantage, and the timing advantage is often the deciding factor in the outcome. Law 10. Vulnerability as strength. In a world that prizes invulnerability, the deliberate reveal of genuine vulnerability is one of the most counterintuitive and most powerful moves available in the domain of influence. Not the performed vulnerability of the person who makes a calculated confession in order to appear relatable while revealing nothing of real significance, but genuine, specific, authentic vulnerability. The honest acknowledgement of limitation, uncertainty, error, or need. The psychology behind this law is straightforward. People trust what is real more than what is polished. They connect with humanness more than with perfection. and they are drawn to the person who is willing to be seen honestly more than to the person who maintains an impeccable surface at all times. The person who never admits uncertainty makes others feel that their own uncertainty is a sign of inadequacy. The person who never acknowledges error makes others feel they must hide their own. The person who maintains a perfectly controlled exterior creates an atmosphere of comparison and potential shame. But the person who says, clearly and without apparent distress, that they were wrong about something, or that they are not sure how to handle a situation, or that they genuinely need help with something, creates instead an atmosphere of permission, of honesty, of mutual humanness, that draws people toward them rather than making them feel inferior. Strategic vulnerability also functions as a powerful trust builder because it signals something important about character. The willingness to be seen honestly, to share something of one's genuine inner reality, is understood by the person receiving it as an act of trust toward them. And being trusted tends to activate the impulse to be trustworthy in return. The boundary of this law is crucial. Vulnerability that is excessive, that floods others with emotional weight they did not ask to carry, that turns every interaction into an opportunity for emotional processing, is not power. It is a form of demand, and it pushes people away rather than drawing them in. The vulnerability that creates influence is specific, bounded, and offered with a quality of ease that signals that you are not asking the other person to rescue you. You are simply being honest. And there is a world of difference between those two things. Law 11. The identity lever. People do not just want things. They want to be certain kinds of people. And the things they want are often in service of the identity they are trying to maintain or the identity they are trying to become. This is the identity lever. The recognition that the deepest motivations are not about acquiring objects or outcomes, but about being a particular kind of person in one's own eyes and in the eyes of others. The influencer who operates only at the level of what someone wants is working on the surface. The influencer who understands what someone is trying to be is working at the level of genuine motivation. And genuine motivation, when engaged, produces a quality of energy and commitment that surface-level desires cannot. This principle has a simple and powerful practical application. When you want to move someone toward a particular behavior, connect that behavior to the identity they claim or aspire to, not as a manipulation, but as a genuine recognition of alignment. If someone sees themselves as a decisive person, show how a particular decision reflects that quality. If someone prides themselves on their loyalty, show how a particular action expresses that loyalty. If someone aspires to be the kind of leader who acts with courage, frame a difficult decision as an expression of exactly that courage. When a person takes an action that they experience as an expression of their identity, they are not just doing something, they are being someone. And that experience of identity-consistent action is intrinsically satisfying in a way that actions taken for purely external reasons are not. It creates a quality of engagement that endures past the initial moment and tends to generate further action in the same direction. The corresponding technique is what might be called the attributed identity, the act of ascribing to someone a positive quality in a way that makes living up to that quality feel natural. When you tell someone that you have always seen them as the kind of person who follows through on commitments, and then make a request that involves following through on a commitment, you have activated their desire to be consistent with the identity you have attributed. And consistency with one's self-concept is one of the most powerful motivators in human psychology. Law 12. The consistency trap. People have a deep need to appear and to be consistent. Once a position has been taken, once a commitment has been made, once a statement has been offered publicly, the psychological pressure to behave consistently with that position, commitment, or statement is powerful enough to produce behavior that the person would not otherwise have chosen. This is the consistency trap, and it is one of the most reliable and widely documented principles in the psychology of influence. Its mechanism is straightforward. Inconsistency is psychologically uncomfortable and socially costly. The person who contradicts themselves, who commits and then fails to follow through, who says one thing and does another, pays a reputational price that most people are strongly motivated to avoid. And this motivation to avoid the cost of inconsistency can be leveraged by creating small prior commitments that make later, larger ones feel like the natural and consistent continuation of a path already started. The classic demonstration of this principle is the foot in the door technique, documented in social psychology research across many contexts. When someone agrees to a small request, they are more likely to agree to a larger subsequent request from the same source. Not because the second request is any more reasonable than it would have been without the prior agreement, but because agreeing to the first request has established a self-concept as someone who cooperates with this type of request. And agreeing to the second request is consistent with that self-concept, while refusing it would not be. The practical applications of the consistency principle are numerous and varied. In negotiation, getting an agreement on principles before the specifics are detailed creates a consistency obligation that makes deviation from those principles in the subsequent specific discussion feel like a contradiction. In relationship building, small early commitments, the agreement to a brief meeting, the acceptance of a minor favor, the public expression of a positive assessment, create a trajectory that subsequent interactions are experienced as continuing rather than initiating fresh. The ethical dimension of this law requires attention. Using the consistency principle to trap someone into a commitment they would not freely have made, by using deceptively small initial requests to establish a direction that the subsequent requests exploit, is manipulation in the negative sense. Using it to help people follow through on commitments they have genuinely made, or to create conditions in which initial agreement with a genuine principle makes subsequent action in accordance with that principle more likely, is legitimate influence in service of authentic outcomes. Law 13, the enemy principle. Nothing unites people more reliably than a common adversary. Nothing clarifies the identity of a group more sharply than the clear definition of what it is against, as well as what it is for. And nothing motivates action more consistently than the vivid, felt presence of a threat to something valued. This is the enemy principle, and it is among the most powerful and the most dangerous of the 15 laws in this book. Powerful because the psychology it activates is among the oldest and most deeply rooted in human nature. Dangerous because the use of enemy creation as a motivational tool has, across history, been responsible for some of the most destructive episodes of collective behavior that humanity has produced. The psychology of the enemy principle rests on the fundamental human need for in-group identity. We define ourselves partly by who we are and partly by who we are not. Groups form their sense of shared identity not just through positive shared characteristics, but through the contrast with an outside, an other, a them against which the we is defined. When the outside is vivid and the threat it poses is felt, the cohesion of the inside increases dramatically. People who have little else in common discover a fierce solidarity in the face of a shared enemy. Skilled leaders have used this principle throughout history to unite disparate constituencies, to motivate action across a coalition that would not have held together without the binding force of a common adversary. The adversary need not be a person or even a specific organization. It can be a force, a trend, a problem, a set of conditions. What matters is that it is vivid, that the threat it poses is real and felt, and that standing against it creates a sense of shared purpose and identity. The ethical constraint on this law is severe and must be stated clearly. The enemy principle becomes destructive when the enemy is falsely attributed, when blame is placed on innocent parties in order to create the cohesive force of opposition, or when the threat is manufactured or grossly exaggerated in order to manipulate behavior. These uses of the enemy principle are not just ethically indefensible. They are strategically self-defeating in the long run because they require the continuous maintenance of a false reality and the inevitable credibility damage that comes when that reality is eventually exposed. The legitimate use of the enemy principle is the clear, honest naming of genuine obstacles, real adversarial forces, or actual threats that a group faces. When a leader helps their team see clearly and collectively the competitive pressures they are actually under, the genuine obstacles between them and their goals, the real forces working against their success, they are not manufacturing an enemy. They are clarifying a reality that can serve as a unifying and motivating force precisely because it is true. Law 14. The withdrawal principle. What is freely available is not desired. What must be worked for, waited for, or earned produces a desire that freely available things simply do not generate. We have touched on this in the discussion of scarcity. But the withdrawal principle adds a specific and powerful dimension: the deliberate, strategic reduction of access to something that was previously present. The psychology behind this is related to what behavioral scientists call the contrast effect and loss aversion. When something is present and then partially or temporarily withdrawn, the experience of its absence is more vivid and more motivating than the simple non-presence of the thing would have been. This is the logic of the intermittent reinforcement that we discussed in relation to fear-based control, but it applies in far less extreme forms across a wide range of influence contexts. In social dynamics, the person who is consistently warm and then becomes briefly cooler activates in others a desire to restore the previous level of warmth that the consistent warmth itself would never have generated. The person who is consistently present and then becomes briefly less available creates a notice of absence that consistent presence never creates. The withdrawal, even if minor and temporary, makes the value of what was withdrawn visible in a way that its constant presence obscures. This principle must be applied with extraordinary care and genuine restraint. The withdrawal that is used cynically to manipulate others' emotions for personal gain at their expense is a form of cruelty. Particularly in intimate relationships, using withdrawal of warmth or attention as a control mechanism causes genuine psychological harm and destroys the quality of the relationship even as it may produce short-term compliance. This use of the principle is not influence. It is abuse. The legitimate application of the withdrawal principle is not strategic cruelty. It is the honest management of one's own genuine availability. The person who has other genuine priorities and who therefore cannot be constantly available is not practicing the withdrawal principle as a manipulation. They are simply living a full life. And the natural consequence of that full life, that their time and attention are genuinely limited, produces in others a genuine and appropriate appreciation of those times when access is granted. The lesson of the withdrawal principle is therefore not to practice false withdrawal. It is to stop practicing false availability, to stop pretending that you have no other priorities, to stop making yourself infinitely accessible out of a fear that being less available will cost you connection. Real connection is built between people who are genuinely living their own lives, who bring their full, autonomous selves to the relationship, and who therefore have something real to give each other rather than an anxious performance of unlimited availability. Law 15. Legacy of influence. Every law in this book has been, in a sense, preparation for this final one. Because the 15 laws of influence are not techniques to be applied to individual interactions, though they certainly apply there. They are, together, a philosophy of long-term power, of the kind of influence that builds across years and decades, and that ultimately outlasts the person who practiced it. The final law is this: the most enduring influence is the influence that creates other influencers. The most lasting power is the power that expands the power of others. The most significant legacy any person of influence can leave is not the outcomes they achieved, not the wealth they accumulated, not even the ideas they propagated, but the people they developed, the minds they expanded, the capabilities they grew in others that continued to operate and multiply long after their direct involvement ended. This is the legacy principle, and it represents the highest expression of everything this audiobook has described. Because it requires all the other laws to be practiced at their fullest, most genuine, most ethical level. You cannot develop others while controlling them through fear. You cannot expand others' capacity while withholding from them the information they need to grow. You cannot create genuine influencers in others while keeping them dependent on your approval and direction. The person who leaves a true legacy of influence is the person who has used every law in this book in service of something larger than their own advancement, who has directed attention toward what truly matters, who has set frames that helped others see more clearly rather than see what the frame setter wanted them to see, who has created need not to exploit it, but to help others recognize and respond to genuine challenges, who has mirrored others in service of genuine connection, who has given generously without keeping score, who has been appropriately scarce without being manipulatively unavailable, who has built genuine authority through genuine competence, who has offered choice that was real, who has timed their influence with patience and respect for others' readiness, who has been genuinely vulnerable in ways that gave others permission to be human, who has spoken to others' identities in ways that helped them grow into their best selves, who has used consistency not to trap, but to build integrity, who has named genuine enemies clearly rather than manufacturing false ones, and who has been genuinely present in ways that made their occasional absence meaningful rather than using withdrawal as a weapon. That person, the person who has practiced all 15 laws with both skill and ethics, leaves behind them not just a record of achievement, but a living network of people who are more capable, more confident, more influential, and more fully themselves for having known them. And that is the highest form of power that any human being can aspire to. Not the power over others, but the power that flows through others, expanding as it travels, creating more capability, more clarity, more genuine influence at every point it touches. That is the manipulation code, fully decoded. Not a guide to control, but a map to genuine, enduring, ethical influence. And what you do with it now is, as it has always been, entirely and completely up to you.